This week, we will look at a range of different visual materials. As mentioned in the previous presentation, different visual media have different functions, histories, and conventions. Therefore, we can't read, for example, a fashion photograph in exactly the same way as an album cover or a billboard. The context of production, so how the image was made and why it was made, and the consumption of the image, so how the audience engages with it, are very different. We live in a world that is saturated with visual information. It's so overwhelming that a lot of the time we engage with visual material on a very superficial level. Still, we recognize that images are powerful and influential. They may have power over us. So, images are cultural products, so analysing them can help us understand more about the world we live in. So, the purpose of this week's learning materials is to develop your skills in visual analysis, consider the role of context, so that be social, historical, cultural, in interpreting visual material, and also to get you to think about where and how images create meaning. But where do we start? When approaching an image, it makes sense to start with the image itself. What sort of image is it, and what does it depict? This is what we might call the first level of analysis. Within semiotics, we call this denotation, referring to literally the persons, places, and things we see. So now, I want you to pause this presentation and spend 5 minutes making some notes describing this image. So please pause it and just start the presentation up again when you're ready. Okay, so let's compare notes. First of all, the image depicts a man in military uniform, shown from the chest up. It's a very classic pose in portraiture. I can tell it's not a photograph, as the very flat, simplified colour may suggest it's a print. But seeing as we're also looking at a digital reproduction, it can be quite difficult to tell exactly, so we need to do some further research. Fortunately here, the reference actually tells us it's a screen print. So, as mentioned, the person is depicted in 3/4 profile. His gaze is fixed to our left, beyond what we can see. His military uniform is highly ornate, so red with gold decorations and feathers, suggesting a man of high status. There are a couple of interesting cultural tensions in the image. The style of uniform suggests an historical image, so late 18th or early 19th century, which is in contrast to the very modern technique of representation. So this use of very flat surface colour and simplified and abstracted features. That suggests to us that the image is much more recent than this. So, as you can see, I moved from denotation, so describing the image, quite quickly into connotation, where we are making interpretations. By drawing on our existing knowledge, so that can be here dress history or art history and political history, this is how we also then need to do some more research. For example, I am not an expert on military uniforms, so I would need to research that a bit more to be able to say more about this particular image. And we also need to do some more research to kind of check our interpretation and expand our analysis. So in this interpretation, we need to apply our knowledge, so our knowledge of dress history, art history. The other tension here is of course this man being black, so of African origin, in this ornate and high status, yet Western style military uniform. So if we date the uniform to approximately late 18th century, We will also know that this is a time when the Western world enslaved Black Africans. So racism and racial oppression was systemic in most parts of the world. Indeed, it was inscribed by law. So I don't know about you, but I want to find out more. So what next? There are several directions our research could go. We've got some key information. So for example, we have the artist's name, Jacob Lawrence, and the title of the image. So the title of the image tells us about who is depicted here. General Toussaint Louverture. We know that we are correct about his high status uniform, and we have a name that may be an historical person. It could be fictional, but which we can now try and find out more about. And I also found this image, which is the original on which the previous image was made into a print. So this, according to Cleveland Museum of Art, is tempera on paper. So here, even in this digitally reproduced version, you can see much more of the texture of the paint. And the image description also gives us some further valuable information. So it says, the life of Toussaint Louverture, number 20, General Toussaint Louverture, statesman and military genius, esteemed by the Spaniards, feared by the English, dreaded by the French, hated by the planters, and reverenced by the blacks, 1938. So this may be the artist's original title for the piece of work. And we know now that is from 1938. So my instinct that told me that this wasn't, this image wasn't created at the time where this man lived was clearly true. And we also have then the details of the artist, where he was from, when he lived, the materials, and the original dimensions of the image. We also know that it belongs to the collection of the Armistead Research Centre at Tulane Universities, and it's a part of the Aaron Douglas collection. So there are now several directions we could take with our research, but personally I'm really curious to find out more about the person it depicts, this legendary Toussaint Louverture. Now, if you are very observant, you may have realised or remembered that the previous presentation, the previous recording, did indeed feature an image of Toussaint. Clearly a very different representation from a very different historical period using different technologies. Doing some more research, we can find a range of images of this man across different collections. And the range of images suggests that this man was an important figure. And this is one of 3 in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery. This image clearly needs to be read differently to the last one. So there are some similarities. It is a portrait of the same man wearing a high status military uniform, but also some important differences. So firstly, it's an engraving, which at the time it was made was a very popular form of image reproduction. So this is where an image was engraved onto a surface, usually copper, and could then be reproduced relatively inexpensively. And this, of course, meant that the image was more accessible and could be consumed by a much wider audience than paintings, for example. So I'd be curious to know more about who would want to see and own an image of Toussaint and why. But let's get back to the image. So as with the previous image, Toussaint is depicted in the foreground of the image in military uniform. We can see other figures in the background who also appear to be in uniform, but it's clearly Toussaint we are meant to be looking at. He's holding up a map or some kind of document indicating, I think, his involvement in strategy. The background with his palm trees also indicates that this is somewhere in the West Indies. We can also see what might be a fort in the background. To get a fuller insight into the character depicted, it's necessary to draw on some secondary sources. So conveniently, I found this interview with an academic expert on Toussaint Louverture on the National Portrait Gallery's website. Okay, so here I'm now on the National Portrait Gallery's website, and this is a page that was put together as a part of Slavery Remembrance Day. So here they've collected material in their collection around Toussaint Louverture, and interestingly here, this is, I believe, the original lithograph, which the previous 1938 image I showed you was most probably based on. But what I really want to show you here is this interview. I'm not going to play the whole thing, just a short clip, but this is a part of an interview with Sutir Hazarizing, who is an expert, an academic and an expert on this character. And he's interviewed by Eddie Ochere. And I'm just going to play the first part, but please feel free. The link is on Blackboard, so please, if you're curious, by all means, watch the interview in its entirety.
Let me thank you for joining us today in this conversation about a remarkable individual whom you've written a most amazing book on, the book being Black Spartacus. So welcome, Sadir, to this.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eddie.
You're welcome.
And it is.
Oh my God, that's the book. What a beautiful cover. Just to quickly put it aside, the cover. Do you know who the artist is?
Yes, the artist is Francois Cauvin, and he's from the Caribbean. He's someone who has produced wonderful work on Haiti, and the lovely thing about this image is that it's actually based on a kind of classic 19th century representation of Toussaint. But what Cauvin has done is, as you can see, to put a guinea fowl on Toussaint's head. And the guinea fowl in Haitian tradition was a bird that was introduced by the settlers, and it immediately, when it was introduced in the island, ran away. So the bird became associated with runaway slaves and became associated with the idea of resisting slavery. And so what Cauvin does in this early 21st century image of Toussaint is to both nod to the kind of classic image of him that we all have, which is basically the sort of bottom half, and add this kind of top bit, which is him symbolizing resistance to slavery and freedom. So I thought it was an absolutely lovely depiction, and also a homage to contemporary Haitian art, which is wonderful.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it sort of comes on a day like today where we are remembering slavery. Ultimately, I think the narrative now is about the resistance to slavery, that humans don't like being enslaved. It's not human nature to be enslaved. And the resistance to slavery, and certainly as it panned out in Haiti, being the first Black Republic, being the first ever nation on earth that was essentially freed itself from the shackles of its oppressors. And Toussaint became the living symbol of this. And I was struck, well, what I wanted to ask you fundamentally was, in one word, how would you describe Toussaint?
He's a revolutionary. He's someone who had decided once he joined the rebellion and what became the revolution of the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue and subsequently Haiti. Once he joined that uprising, he was dedicated to transforming the social and political life of his countrymen and women so that they would never have to experience slavery again. And towards the end of his life, he dedicated himself wholeheartedly to stopping the French from reimposing slavery on the people of Saint-Domingue. So the thread that runs through his entire life is this revolutionary idea that slavery must be abolished and must never be allowed back on Saint-Domingue. And of course, underlying that is the equally revolutionary idea that all human beings are equal.
Yes, yes. I mean, was it true to say his motto was freedom or death?
Well, that was the motto of the French revolutionaries. And of course, Toussaint was someone who believed very passionately in the French Republican ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity. And in the early years of the French Revolution, that's one of the kind of famous slogans of the French revolutionaries: liberté, égalité, fraternité, ou la mort, right? So freedom or death, as you put it. And in the early years of the Haitian Revolution, this motto is appropriated by many of the Haitian revolutionaries, including Toussaint. And one of the things I was able to do for this book is read a lot of his correspondence, read a lot of his military reports, including the speeches that he gives to his own soldiers. And you see, if not this exact expression, but you see him very often saying, particularly towards the end of his speeches, that, okay, we're about to take on the enemy, whether it's the British, the Spaniards, the white settlers who are in favor of slavery, whoever the enemy is. I mean, he kind of explains to his soldiers why they need to be overcome. And at the end, he always says something like, we would rather die than have slavery reimposed upon us. So this idea that death was preferable to enslavement was something that was very much part of his thinking and the way he lived his life.
Okay, so going back to the image we've got here and our theme of gender, it's clear that the image represents a kind of heroic masculinity. And it's not entirely unlike depictions of other military heroes of the era, such as Napoleon or Nelson or the Duke of Wellington. But what's interesting to me is the way in which the conventions of representing heroic masculinity are subverted by the knowledge that he's black and a former slave. So here his muscular strength, I think, connotes power and a kind of embodied freedom, not the muscles acquired through the physical toil of slavery, as is often the case in this era's representation, particularly the kind of anti-slavery representations. His heroism is a result of a challenge to his social status. It's not a result of it. You know, we know that he was born powerless, but his battle has been a battle of empowerment, not suppression and domination, as is often the case with this kind of genre of painting. Right, so finally, hopefully you get a sense of just how much there is to say potentially about an image and all the kind of directions you can go and take your analysis. But so your task here this week is to analyse either of these two images. You can of course do both if you'd like to, and we will then go through and discuss these in the seminar session. So, but before you get started on your analysis, I'm just going to summarise that first of all, you start with the description, so what we called the denotation. Then you move on to your interpretation, so the connotation of the image. Throughout, draw on good quality sources to inform the analysis. And I want you to also perhaps think about how and where meaning is made in the image. So, do you want to emphasize the image itself and how the image itself, through what it depicts, creates meaning? Or are you more interested in perhaps the artist, the photographer, it could also be a designer, illustrator, and what their intention was? And also more widely, who commissioned it and what was their intention behind this particular image? I also want you to think about audience. So who was this image created for? and what were potentially audience reactions? How was the audience meant to kind of engage with this image, and what kind of meanings did it have sort of circulating within culture? And then I particularly, because this is a theme of this whole term, I want you to think about how these images represent gender. What can these images tell us about gender ideals and cultural representations of gender? Okay, so over to you.